great healthcare system that supplies care and does great research that all American citizens benefit from.
J. David Cox, the President of the American Federation of Government Employees, thanks for joining us. We're now going to take you live to today's session on the House floor.
Communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 5th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Ted Poe to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Reverend Eugene Hemrick, Catholic University, Washington, D.C.
Lord, paraphrasing the love of St. Francis, may this Congress be an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let it sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that our Congress may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born again to eternal life. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance to be led by the gentleman from California, Mr. Barrett.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. What purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, on Thursday the Capitol was in lockdown when Miriam Carey led the police on a frightening high-speed chase that sadly resulted in her death. Initial reports say she may have been delusional, paranoid, and had a prescription for schizophrenia medication. The incident shows that a person with untreated or undertreated mental illness does not need a firearm to cause harm. It reminds us of an issue that we've been talking about since the tragedy at Newtown and even before, the problems with our nation's mental health system. There are 38,000 suicides in our country recently, 750,000 attempts. The House Energy and Commerce Committee has identified inefficient outpatient and inpatient treatment. State involuntary commitment laws are failing to help those with schizophrenia and paranoid delusions. Community mental health centers are underfunded. Federal privacy laws have problems, and NIMH is woefully underfunded. I'll be introducing legislation soon to deal with these mental health issues. I ask my colleagues to help us deal with serious mental illness in a serious way. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, day number 5 of government shutdown. Day number 5. Yesterday you said something that I couldn't agree with more. Mr. Speaker, yesterday you said, this is not a game. Last night, my staff gave me a letter from one of my constituents, Sarah from Folsom. Her close friend is battling a rare bone cancer. She's been in chemotherapy and she's fighting for her life. She has a 1-year-old daughter. She was recently accepted into a clinical trial, a last chance to try to save herself and save her life. Now Congress has shut down that trial and put the trials on hold. Here's what Sarah says: please don't let my friend and don't let her daughter grow up without a mother. Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree with you more. This is not a game. This is real life. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I speak on the House floor for the third straight day to request that President Obama obey the Pay Our Military Act that fully funds all defense workers who, quote, support the armed forces, end quote. Since every defense worker, by definition, supports the armed forces, furloughs for every defense worker should end. Over 60 congressmen and I are highlighting this issue in hopes of returning 400,000 furloughed defense workers to their jobs. I am pleased to announce that we're making progress. Yesterday, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel agreed that, quote, there's no job in our Department of Defense that doesn't support the military, end quote. Hence, the Pay Our Military Act's only furlough ending requirement has been met. Mr. Speaker, President Obama must end all defense worker furloughs. Why? Because it's the law and because America's national security is at stake. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, this last week must have been quite a civics lesson for the members of the Tea Party who thought that they could shut down the government and in fact shut down the government and nobody would miss it. But soon they discovered that there were serious problems with that. And now we see one bill after another to restore the NIH because they found they stranded cancer patients and other people in need of their health. To restore the WIC program because they found out that the newest born infants in this country would be without nutrition. The veterans programs because they found out our veterans would be stranded. Their aid to the assistance to go to school would be cut off. Our national parks. They never thought those communities would be impacted by the national parks. They didn't care about that. They shut them down. But they were here asking for relief. They found out they needed the Weather Service as a hurricane is now approaching or was approaching our Gulf states. They needed FEMA. They needed someone to organize the evacuation routes in case it became a full-blown hurricane. The CIA, they discovered they laid off 70% of the assets within the CIA. This goes on and on and on. Welcome to America, a big, diverse nation where we all need one another at one time or another.
Time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we have a chance on the floor today to move this body in the right direction, to move us closer to a solution. There's a bipartisan bill today offered by Mr. Moran and Mr. Wolf, both of Virginia. It's a bill that I've co-sponsored and a bill, thankfully, that the President has agreed to sign. It is the Federal Employees Retroactive Pay Fairness Act, which would allow all federal employees, regardless of individual furlough status, to receive their pay retroactive from October 1st for the entirety of the budget impasse. The stalemate we're at now has left 800,000 government employees furloughed and unsure about their next paycheck. There are also those at work now who aren't being paid for it. This includes thousands of federal law enforcement officers who continue even today to protect this building and those of us in it and around it. I've been in touch with federal workers in my district, including law enforcement, and they should know that there's agreement that they will receive their pay when the government reopens. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be voting in favor of this legislation for all the federal employees in my district and around the country who deserve some certainty while we wait for this impasse to end. Mr. Speaker, let's continue to talk and let's end this impasse. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition? The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak about the human consequences of this needless government shutdown. The impact of this shutdown on real people and families back in our homes. There are so many people out there who are hurt and are worried about what's going on here in Washington and how can any of us blame them. Let me just give you one example. I have a woman from the Quad Cities, which is an area I represent, who reached out to our office. She's worked at the Rock Island Arsenal for 15 years, and she told me how much she loved her job. But she was furloughed earlier this year because of sequestration, and now she's out of work indefinitely because of this needless government shutdown. She's worried, like any of us would be, about how she's going to make ends meet, how she's going to support her family, and how frustrated she is with the government. We need to encourage good people like this woman from the Quad Cities to stay in public service, not drive them away. She is one of more than 2,500 workers at the Rock Island Arsenal who are impacted by this. I say to my colleagues on the left and my colleagues on the right, let's work together and solve this.
Gentlelady's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from Tennessee seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, words have meaning, pardon me, and I find it so interesting as I come to the floor this morning that I continue to hear my colleagues talk about a clean CR. Well, for my colleagues and for my constituents, I want to explain what this means. They want to say no attachments, no further accountabilities, no spending reductions, just give us the money. And I would remind them the levels that we're spending at are due to sequestration. It's the law. It's the law. That's where it's at. By implication, they are saying what you all want is unclean or evil or dirty. What we are for, Mr. Speaker, is an accountable, transparent CR, an accountable, transparent process, transparent and fair to hardworking taxpayers, fair to future generations, like my grandsons, my nieces, great-nieces and nephews, who are going to have to pay the bill. Let's have an accountable spending process. I yield back.
Time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition? Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, words do have meaning, and instead of working together to do our jobs and resolve these critical issues, Republicans have taken a decidedly different approach, one that seemed to have been looking forward to for some time, and to make another desperate attempt to stop the Affordable Care Act. Their government shutdown could be the most damaging thing to hit our economy since the budget sequestration they imposed on Americans. And I would say to my colleague that I just heard from, the prayer this morning is so appropriate, a prayer of St. Francis. Make me a keeper of your peace. There's people that are hurting and are in trouble. Let us look inside to the moral obligations that we have and see what we can do to come together. Please, let us vote on the continuing resolution passed by the Senate. These are the Republican budget numbers that Democrats have agreed to compromise with. Please, listen to St. Francis, look inside and see what we can do together. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how have we ended up here in a government shutdown that nobody wanted? The answer is simple. It's because the Senate has refused to even come to the negotiating table on a spending agreement. The House has passed 4 measures that would have kept the government open and operating, but they were all ignored by the Senate. First, we voted to keep the government open and to fund the President's health care bill, but they ignored that. Second, we voted to keep the government open and only delay the health care bill for 1 year. They ignored that. Then we voted to keep the government open and simply make the rules for the health care exchanges the same for all Americans. They ignored that. And lastly, we just asked the Senate to talk to us. They ignored that. The Obama administration has given exceptions to their allies, big business, and some unions. Why shouldn't the American people be given the same kind of treatment? The Senate should come to the bargaining table today and end the shutdown today. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Yes, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
The fault of the reason we have this shutdown is because of the Republican leadership. And the irony today is that the Republicans keep talking about the other side of the aisle here, or the other house, Yet they're going to go home at around 12 o'clock today, if not sooner, and not come back until Monday after 6:30. So if you really cared about negotiating and doing something, you wouldn't send everyone home for the next 3 days. You are not serious. The spending levels have already been agreed on. I heard our Democratic leader, Ms. Pelosi, on the floor the other day saying she agreed with the spending levels. So the money isn't the issue, and I don't even hear the health care reform being talked about much anymore on the Republican side of the aisle. I have no idea why the Speaker of the House continues to keep the government shut down, other than maybe they think they can show that they can do it. This is absurd, and it's cruel on the people that are being furloughed. The effect on the economy is just awful at this point with this continued shutdown. You come here and say you're going to piecemeal approach, and we have bills every day to open up a little part of the government. Open the entire government. Pass a clean resolution.
Gentleman's time has expired. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Any recorded vote on postponed question will be taken later. Yes. What purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 58.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 58, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress regarding the need for the continued availability of religious services to members of the armed forces and their families during a lapse in appropriations.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on the concurrent resolution under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the concurrent resolution offered by my colleague, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, a dedicated chaplain and Iraq veteran of the United States Air Force Reserve. His resolution goes to the heart of our constitutionally guaranteed ability to worship without interference. I thank him for bringing it to the floor. The resolution expresses the sense of Congress regarding the need for the continued availability of religious services to members of the armed forces and their families during a lapse of appropriations. As a grateful dad with my wife Roxanne of 4 sons currently serving in the military, and I know firsthand of the importance of chaplains such as Steve Shugart and Brian Bowman. Specifically, it addresses the issue this House became aware of yesterday, that religious services for military personnel are being curtailed or not offered at all because federal civilian employees serving as chaplains or personnel contracted to perform the duties of military chaplains have been furloughed. This is an extremely important issue for all of us to work together. There is no doubt that the furloughing of personnel hired or contracted to perform the duties of military chaplains is having an effect. Just in this region, church services, baptisms, weddings have been curtailed. For example, the active duty priest at the Navy Yard canceled Mass there. He's needed at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. It's a larger church, and they don't have a priest there this weekend. At Belvoir, half of the Masses have been canceled. The impact is even more severe overseas, where options for worship are far more limited than the United States. What's more disturbing is that the general schedule of federal civilian and contractor chaplains are being told that if they do come to their jobs, they'll be trespassing. This is just not right. The performance of religious services and the provision of ministry are protected activities under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. If the Department of Interior can permit World War II veterans and performance of First Amendment activities to visit the memorial constructed to honor their service, then certainly the Secretary of Defense can permit similar First Amendment activities. The Secretary can and must allow military chaplains and other personnel, including contract personnel, hired to perform duties of a military chaplain to perform religious services and ministry. In the same manner and to the extent as such chaplains and other personnel are otherwise permitted to perform religious services and ministry when there is an appropriation. It's that simple. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge the Secretary of Defense to do the simple thing, the right thing. Allow all chaplains of the armed forces to be their military and federal civilian employees or contractors to minister unhindered to the men and women of the armed forces of the United States. I congratulate my colleague, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, chaplain of the U.S. Air Force Reserve, for bringing this resolution to the floor and urge all members to support it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina reserves his time. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I do not oppose this resolution. It sounds sensible going forward. But I do want to raise a couple of process issues. We found out about this, I found out about this 20 minutes ago. And I think it's just emblematic of how much this body has broken down. We have to talk to each other. I don't have an objection to this. I've got, a staff. Armed Services Committee has a staff. We work together. We've worked together on the Armed Services Committee better than any other committee in this Congress. And I will grant you that that isn't saying much. But we have. And we just simply have to talk to each other. Why would we spring this on us at the last minute, not have a communication about it? It's not something we object to. And getting past this individual issue, it is emblematic of the entire problem. Now, the Republicans are complaining because the Senate isn't talking to them and the President isn't talking to them about the CR and the debt ceiling. There are reasons for that. But we have reached an epidemic of not talking to each other. On something as small as this, we can't even have a communication. We can't.
Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
I will gladly yield.
And Mr. Smith, I agree. On the Armed Services Committee, and I want to commend you, we work together in extraordinary fashion. In fact, the National Defense Authorization Act has passed the House as an indication of your goodwill and good faith. I believe the reason this has come up so quickly, of course, is because this was only learned late yesterday. The consequence of the thought of chaplains to be declared trespassing is inconceivable, and it needs to be addressed.
Right. But again, the communications level has fallen apart. On our side of the aisle, we don't know from one minute to the next what we're going to be voting on. And I'm reclaiming my time. The schedule has been changed on a moment's notice. And I'll tell you, even back in the shutdown of 1995, there was greater communication between the majority and the minority about what was going on. In fact, we had a lot of these small little bills that funded little pieces of the government. But the one thing the majority did is they granted the full House a vote on and what a clean resolution means is it only pertains to spending. It doesn't pertain to other policy issues. That vote was granted. The House Republicans voted it down. That was their position. But at least we had a vote. Okay? And then we also had a discussion about what we could fund during the shutdown. The complete and utter breakdown in communication between the majority party, the minority party, the Senate and the House, the White House and us, is doing an unbelievable disservice to this country. I don't care if we get in a room and yell at each other for 4 hours. Let's at least have the communication, because I want to really paint the picture here. We all have our talking points. And I heard all of those talking points this morning. I've heard them so much, and I'm sure that the American people and I are absolutely sick to death of those talking points. They're poll-tested, they're wonderful, they play to the base, they're great, and here we are on day 5 going nowhere. The basic problem here, number one on the CR, is the health care policy issue. That basically the Republicans, this is no secret, want to get rid of the health care law. The trouble is they don't have the votes to do it. And they are therefore willing to hold up the funding of the government in order to advance their policy agenda. And that's a very important point, because that plays into the larger issue. I also want to tell you that we are, 12 days now away from defaulting. And we are going to default at this point. Because what I hear from my Republican colleagues is, oh, no, we don't want to default. As long as we cut enough spending, as long as we do tax reform, we'll be fine, which, of course, is what we've been hearing since January of 2011. And I just want to explain briefly to the American people what the difference in the positions are here. And I'm going to be as fair and honest as I can be. The Republicans believe strongly that we should severely cut spending. And cutting spending at this point means mandatory programs, entitlements, because we've already cut discretionary spending down to the BCA level, down to the level that they agreed to. That's what some of my colleagues are referencing about the CR. The spending level is down there, but they don't want to do that. And, you know, the deficit is high, so they want to cut spending. And the President has on more than one occasion put entitlement cuts on the table. The difference of opinion is whether or not we should also raise taxes as part of that deal to deal with the deficit. The President, the Senate, Democrats in the House, which I realize is irrelevant because we don't have the votes, but unfortunately for you guys, they do in the Senate, and the President has the veto. If there's going to be any entitlement cuts, they have to be accompanied by tax increases. And the Republicans say, absolutely not. We're not going to do that. So that is the divide. And the problem is the Republicans won 234 seats in the House. Interestingly, they lost the overall vote in Congress by a count of 52 to 48, but redistricting plays out the way it does. But they did not win the presidency, and they did not win the Senate. So they were trying to take those 234 votes in the House and jam their broader agenda down everybody's throat. And the piece that they have is they are willing to not fund the government and not raise the debt ceiling in order to put us in a bad position to do that. And I'll tell you, Democrats cannot vote to cut entitlements if there are not tax increases attached to them. So I hope somebody, somewhere, wakes up to this reality before we default and stops insisting that somehow, miraculously, in the next 12 days, Democrats are going to magically agree to cut entitlements with no revenue and maybe do some big complicated tax reform bill that cuts taxes even further. Because if that reality does not set in, we are in for several weeks of great calamity that's going to cause greater damage than what has been caused here. So with that, I support the resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves his time. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
And Mr. Smith, again, I want to, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I want to again commend Mr. Smith. He indeed has reached across to try to work together, and by referencing the shutdown in 1995, there is a difference, and it begins at the top. Sadly, the President of the United States, 2 weeks ago last night, called to announce he was not going to negotiate. In the 1995 shutdown, there was communication between the President and the Speaker prior to a shutdown and during the entire shutdown. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. John Fleming.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend Congressman Wilson. I also thank my good friend Doug Collins for bringing this measure up today. Mr. Speaker, the First Amendment rights of our military do not sunset with the lack of appropriations or even a shutdown. The free exercise of religion is codified in the Constitution of the United States and celebrated by every American, including those of us who have, do, or will wear the uniform. Military chaplains faithfully serve a unique role in the military, bridging the gap between faith and freedom and ensuring that peoples of all beliefs are able to celebrate Mass or participate in a worship service according to the dictates of their faith. Despite this protected right, the Department of Defense has decided to effectively close the doors of many churches and chapels this weekend by not allowing military chaplains to perform their religious duties on military installations because the federal government has not passed the relevant appropriations bill of FY 2014. Mr. Speaker, I contend that the freedom of religion does not follow the federal government's fiscal policy. The freedom of religion is a 24/7 constitutional right that should garner unconditional support from this administration and our military leaders. I stand strong with the brave men and women serving in our nation's military and urge my colleagues to support this resolution. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. The President of the United States has spent weeks of his term negotiating with the Republican Party, and what he's been confronted with each time is a demand to either shut the government down or default on the country's debt. But I want to put this in another frame of reference as I rise in support of this bill. On 8 occasions when President George W. Bush was president, we had the majority on our side, and we agreed to a continuing resolution, a clean continuing resolution. We had our many differences with President Bush over the Iraq War, over issues of health care, over issues of the budget, but on 8 occasions, President Bush came to the Democratic majority and asked to continue running the government, and we said yes. The principle at stake here is whether negotiation means you have to have everything you want all the time and shut the government down if you don't. That's not the way we do business. That's why 3/4 of the American people agree that shutting the government down over the health care law is the wrong thing to do. I yield back.
Yields back his time. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the Congresswoman from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have all heard, we received this news yesterday that our priests and ministers could end up facing government arrest if they attempt to celebrate Mass or openly practice their faith on a military base during this government shutdown, a shutdown we did not want, a shutdown that could have been avoided had the President and Senator Reid agreed to negotiate with us. This is so unfortunate, and what we see is no Mass, no communion, no confession, no prayer, no faith, no religion. But, Mr. Speaker, what we have to realize is that religious beliefs predate government. Government should not be able to tell those who are religious whether they can practice their faith freely, regardless of our government funding situation. What we are seeking is accountability, transparency, and reducing what the federal government spends. Government funding is irrelevant to the religious rights and freedoms that are enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. And some don't get to throw away the Constitution just because they're unwilling to sit down and negotiate and work with us through this process. We're not going to sit here and say, even if you volunteer to serve the faithful, that we are going to deny you. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, will our priests and ministers this weekend, some of them on my post at Fort Campbell in my district, are they going to be arrested if they recite a Hail Mary, if they lead in prayer? I think that it is time for us to pass this legislation to agree that we let our men and women in uniform pray. Let America pray. Government shouldn't arrest anyone because some want to play politics with this situation. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, again, I support this resolution. Nobody is getting arrested for praying. I really wish we could keep the debate here in the realm of reality. I believe the issue is that they have been furloughed in some instances, so they're not allowed to carry on the services. So I don't want that misimpression left dangling out there that somehow we're arresting people for going to church. We are most certainly not, and I wish the debate would remain a little bit more accurate. And I want to make just one other point. While it is true that in '95 President Clinton talked to Republicans, ultimately he did not give them any of the policy items that they were asking for, and all President Obama basically is saying, look, you want to talk, we can talk, but we can't talk about dismantling my health care law, and we can't talk about adding policy riders to the CR or to the debt ceiling, because we need to keep the government running. And there is one other difference, which I know my Republican colleagues will not address. The Republican majority under Newt Gingrich in 1995 gave this House a vote, just like the Senate has given everything you've sent over to them a vote. They voted it down, but they had a vote. This House will not give us a vote on the CR that the Senate has passed. If you feel as strongly about it as you do what the Republicans in 1995 did. Bring it up and vote it down. That's democracy. That's in the Constitution, too, by the way. That would be helpful. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
And Mr. Smith, I appreciate, again, your support of this, but it is important because, sadly, information has been provided that chaplains would be subject to trespassing charges. So this does obviously interfere with the ability of freedom of speech and religion and assembly. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Tim Hulskamp.
The gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, is it really the policy of this administration to make church services illegal, to threaten Catholic priests with jail if they celebrate Mass this weekend? Unfortunately, this policy seems to be another tragic reflection of the complete disregard this administration has for Americans of faith. What's worse, it's an unprecedented denial of a fundamental constitutional right of our men and women in uniform, like denying access to the World War II or Lincoln memorials for the first time. This is the first time in 17 previous funding lapses covering 16 Sundays that our brave chaplains have been threatened with arrest if they perform their godly duties. Secretary Hagel must issue an immediate directive that chaplains should continue to perform their duties and that DoD facilities normally used for religious services should continue to be used. Mr. Speaker, the First Amendment is not some empty words on a dusty, archaic document to be viewed somewhere in a museum. No, for men like my uncle, Father Leonard Stegman, who was a chaplain, active duty chaplain for nearly 30 years, the First Amendment is what you do every day as a chaplain, leading men and women of all faiths. It's something real for the late Father Emil Capon, who was recently awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama on April 11th of this year. For Father Emil, the First Amendment was not, again, some empty words. It's what he did every day. It's the reason he gave his life for his country. It's the reason he is honored and recognized, and how he drew men and women of all faith. In honor of Father Capon and all current and former military chaplains and all members of the armed forces, let's strike a blow for religious liberty today, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution and sending a clear message to this administration that the rights of those serving in our armed forces cannot be suspended simply to create political and personal pain. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
I reserve as well.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield the remainder of the time to the sponsor of this resolution, the U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Doug Collins.
How much time?
Mr. Smith, do you have any other speakers you'd like to yield?
Sorry. I do not. You have the right to close, so I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back his time. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
And I yield to the sponsor of this resolution, Congressman Doug Collins, a U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina whose dedication to our men and women in uniform is among no peer in this body, and I thank him for his service and for the fight of his family and others as we come along. I tell you today, I rise, Mr. Speaker, really with a troubled heart, but also with one that is on behalf of the men and women in the Air Force and the armed forces and other that are facing something today that they should not have to have faced. There's no doubt our nation is facing many difficulties, and both we across the aisle can understand that, and the majority in this body is standing united to fight for the future of our children and grandchildren. Those are legitimate fights, and I respect my colleague from across the aisle. These are legitimate fights that we are having here. However, today as I stand, I came to this body also looking for practical things and looking for things that amaze me at times, and this is one that does. But as we do and as we fight for others, we must ensure that the basic rights of all Americans are protected and do not fall victim to the political theater occurring in this body. Military personnel and their families make sacrifices that many of us cannot fathom, and they do so to protect the freedom that we take far too often for granted.
Because of their sacrifice, our nation is a beacon of hope to the dark corners of the world where freedom of speech and religion exist only in fairy tales. Yet today, military chaplains who have been contracted to come to bases face a closed door. They cannot go, even if they wanted to volunteer, to practice their faith on these bases during a lapse of appropriations. Each of us in this body across the nation should pause for a moment to consider, think about what I just said. If a chaplain wants to minister, a contract chaplain wants to minister to a military member stationed abroad who has no access to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, they would be in violation of the law. I'm a military chaplain, and this breaks my heart. Too often we come to this floor and we talk in abstracts. We talk about concepts, political jargon, arguing about problems that only matter probably within less than 3 miles of this building. But today is different. Today we stand with one resounding voice to tell our service members in the chaplaincy that we will not stand for their First Amendment rights to be violated because the leaders of the other body want to make a point. The laws of this nation require the federal government to ensure military personnel can express their faith or non-faith in all corners of the world. That is why the military chaplaincy exists, and the need for those that when we cannot serve, we contract with others who can provide that basis of their faith. General George Washington issued an order on July 9, 1776, providing through the Continental Congress for a chaplain for each regiment, stating, "The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger." The administration is apparently unsatisfied with denying veterans access to memorials, unsatisfied with closing off unmanned scenic overlooks to motorists. Now they must go after, in the words of George Washington, the blessing and protection of heaven for our military families. The body has seen its share of political discord and policy disagreements. The government has experienced numerous lapses in appropriations over the decades, but never before in the history of this nation have the military chaplains and those that they contract with to serve our military personnel been prevented from meeting the religious and spiritual needs of our service members. As a chaplain, I lived and worked alongside men and women in Iraq. Many were religious and many were not. But my purpose was to ensure that they were able to express their First Amendment rights however they wished. Military chaplains must be allowed, and their contract counterparts must be allowed to provide religious service and ministry regardless of our nation's fiscal state. If the administration wants to play games and score points through unnecessary theatrics, so be it. But I will not stand by and let these games occur at the expense of basic rights of our men and women in uniform. During this lapse in funding, active duty chaplains are permitted to continue serving military personnel. However, there's a chronic shortage of active duty chaplains, particularly for Catholic and Jewish faiths. For example, roughly 25% of the military ascribe to the Catholic faith, but yet Catholic priests make up only 8% of the chaplain corps. That means that approximately 275,000 men and women in uniform and their families are served by only 234 active duty priests, thus the need to have contract chaplains. Due to the shortage of active duty chaplains, it is extremely common for the government to employ chaplains via contract to ensure the spiritual needs of all our military members are met. With the government shut down, contract members of the chaplain corps on military bases worldwide are not permitted to work, not even permitted to volunteer, even if they're the only chaplain on base. As my friend from South Carolina and others have mentioned, the restrictions on basic freedoms that are being had around here and just within this area, at Langley, at the Navy Yard, at Fort Belvoir, these are all areas in which these have already been cut back, and that is a shame. I'm grateful to my colleagues who joined me this morning and the House leadership for their commitment to ensuring that military chaplains are able to serve the men and women of our armed forces. If this body does not pass this legislation, the ability of military personnel and their family to worship and participate in religious ceremonies will continue to be at great risk. I ask all my colleagues to join me in protecting the First Amendment rights of those who give their lives to protect ours. And before I close, I agree that many times we haven't communicated, and we don't communicate as many would want us to. But I've also heard that timing was a problem here, and that we should have saw this coming. Well, let me just say timing should never be a hindrance to this body protecting the First Amendment rights of any of our citizens, and especially our military personnel. In fact, this should be our highest calling and the thing we run to this floor to discuss. And should we have seen it coming? I tell you, what saddens me is I would have never believed that the administration or anyone else would deem protecting a constitutional right as non-essential. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 58? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 371, I call up H.R. 3223, the Federal Employee Retroactive Pay Fairness Act, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3223, a bill to provide for the compensation of furloughed federal employees.
Pursuant to House Resolution 371, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 40 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 3223 and to include extraneous material thereon.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, the House remains actively engaged in finding a solution to end the current impasse. The House has passed a number of common-sense bills to fund our troops, continuing funding for veterans' benefits, and allow the District of Columbia to spend its own funds. The House has also passed legislation to bring defense civilian employees back to work. Unfortunately, the administration appears to be purposefully refusing to use the authority granted by the Pay Our Military Act, meaning roughly 400,000 defense civilian employees remain at home, unable to work. While we wait on the President and Senate to reach across the aisle, it is important to provide needed certainty to federal employees who have been furloughed without pay. Each and every one of us has federal employees in our district, most of whom are guided by a sense of civic duty and take pride in helping make their country a better place. Civilian defense personnel at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, doctors and nurses at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and records management professionals at the National Archives, and countless other dedicated men and women throughout my community are employed by federal agencies and have been subject to furlough. In the Gulf Coast region and other disaster-prone areas, NOAA employees help prepare for and monitor major storms. In the aftermath of these natural disasters, FEMA workers are sent into horrible and hazardous conditions to help restore broken communities. At NASA, employees help us figuratively and literally reach for the stars. They encourage future generations to not be bound by seemingly physical and intellectual barriers. Our law enforcement agencies work tirelessly to investigate and capture those who seek to do harm to the homeland as well as our allies abroad. And the list goes on. H.R. 3223 ensures that federal civilian workers will receive retroactive pay for the duration of their federal government shutdown, regardless of their furlough status. Federal workers who have been furloughed under a shutdown historically have received their pay retroactively. H.R. 3223 provides today's workforce a guarantee that their pay will resume once the President and Senate Democrats agree to meaningful discussions that will ultimately resolve this impasse. I urge support for this bill as we continue to work on legislation to reopen critical operations of the federal government. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Maryland.
Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman yields is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 3223, the Federal Employee Retroactive Pay Fairness Act. This legislation would provide back pay to 800,000
hard-working, and dedicated federal employees furloughed as a result of the government shutdown we are now enduring. Today is day 5 of the shutdown created by the Tea Party extremists who are harming our country by holding our government hostage. They're placing our economy and our national security in jeopardy by waging an ideological war to overturn the law of the land and put insurance companies back in charge of health care decisions for tens of millions of our fellow Americans. Our dedicated public servants ought to be at their duty stations serving the American people right now. They want to be working. They should be working. But instead, they are locked out because the House Republican leadership refuses to allow a vote on a clean bill to fund the government, a bill that would pass today. 17 years ago, federal workers were given back pay after Newt Gingrich's record 21-day shutdown in 1995 and 1996. It was a fair thing to do then, and it is a fair thing to do now. Our federal employees have been under relentless and unfair attack in recent years and have sacrificed much already. They have contributed nearly $100 billion to deficit reduction through the 3-year pay freeze. New employees have seen their retirement benefits slashed. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, many have suffered through sequester-imposed furloughs. And now, many families have seen their lives needlessly disrupted by this shutdown. The least we can do for our fellow citizens who work for this great country is to give them the reassurance of knowing that they will receive back pay. The irresponsible, piecemeal approach to government funding being pursued by our House Republicans omits huge parts of the government and attempts to pick and choose those who will be paid and those who won't. That is not an efficient or effective way to run the government. And the American people are sick of it, and they must be heard. H.R. 3223, and I give great credit to my colleagues, Mr. Moran and to Mr. Wolf, a bipartisan group of great Virginians. I applaud them, but this 3223 would ensure that all federal workers will be paid once this manufactured crisis is over and the government is reopened. This is not their fault, and they should not suffer as a result. It's long past time for Republicans to reopen the government. Instead of disrupting the lives of our fellow citizens and wasting time and taxpayer money, House Republicans should reopen the government today, not yesterday, right now, by simply bringing to the floor a measure that funds the entire government without taking away the health care of our fellow citizens. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join all of us in supporting H.R. 3223, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, the author of the bill we're considering today that would retroactively restore the pay to federal workers.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I want to thank Mr. S. Unanimous consent, revise and extend. I want to thank Mr. Turner. I want to thank Chairman Rogers and his staff. I also want to thank Leader Cantor and his staff, and Mr. Moran, Mr. Cummings, and the others, and all the staff, my staff too have been helped, but all the staff who did this very, very quickly. This was done during the Reagan administration. It was done during the Clinton administration. Who are the federal employees? The federal employees are the FBI agents that everyone would call. If they got a call and found out their loved one was kidnapped, the first person they would call would be an FBI agent, a federal employee. I was with Mr. Hoyer 2 weeks ago at the Navy Yard. The 12 people who were killed at the Navy Yard and those who were wounded, they were all federal employees. And Mr. Hoyer can tell you, when the CNO talked about it, he said they are part of the fleet. They are part of the fleet. The Capitol Hill policemen that we all got up the other day and gave a standing ovation, they are federal employees. The VA doctors that are working out at Walter Reed, working on young men and women who have lost limbs, who have served in Afghanistan and Iraq, they are federal employees. I remember I was with, again, Mr. Hoyer when we were down at OPM earlier this year when they had stars on the wall of 27 federal employees that died since 2012. And since that time, the number of stars have been added tremendously. I saw the movie Zero Dark 30. If you looked at that movie, it was about catching bin Laden. The woman who did it, Maya, has she been furloughed? Where is Maya? We don't know where she is, but has she been furloughed? Should she not get paid? And lastly, I remember being at the memorial service. If you saw the book and read the movie, 7 families walked in. 7 individuals died. And I saw the young families, the families who were mourning their parents. They are federal employees. About 12,000 CIA employees have been furloughed and have gone, maybe missing that one communication from Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda. I strongly urge a strong vote for this and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio, reserves. Reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from the state of Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to thank my colleague Frank Wolf. There's no harder advocate, more effective advocate for federal employees than Frank Wolf. He and I have worked together for over 32 years on behalf of the interest of those people who work for the American people every day to make them safer, healthier, more informed. I want to thank myself, the Majority Leader. I want to thank the Ranking Member. I want to thank the gentleman who offers his support of this bill. And I want to thank my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we're 5 days into a government shutdown caused by, well, I'm not sure what it's caused by. As a result, approximately 800,000 middle-class workers who serve the American people are furloughed without pay. All of us talk about working Americans, how we want to make sure they have the jobs that they need to support themselves and their family. Our federal employees have already been asked to accept COLA freezes for the past 4 years, and they've endured changes to retirement benefits as well as the furloughs imposed by the irrational policy of sequester. I'm glad to see the chairman of the Appropriations Committee on the floor. There's been no more stronger voice on the irrationality of the sequester than my friend from Kentucky. Only my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can say with certainty, if they can, when our federal government will be able to go back to work. But the American people are already noticing their absence, whether safeguarding our national parks, performing groundbreaking medical research at NIH, overseeing disaster relief efforts after a storm or wildfire, making sure nutrition assistance gets to the children and seniors who need it, or enforcing the laws that keep our communities safe. Federal employees make a critical contribution to the country and communities and the American people they serve. We saw their selfless nature and devotion to country on display this Thursday when, as the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf said, when U.S. Capitol Police personnel, federal employees who are deemed essential for security and are currently on the job without the promise of pay, protected all of us who work in the Capitol complex during a security incident. I am proud to represent 62,000 hardworking federal employees in my district. Yet most of the federal employees are not in the Washington metropolitan area. 80% of them are dispersed throughout this country, serving in every area, every community of our great land, many of whom serve in civilian defense roles at critical military institutions like Pax River, Indian Head, and Webster Field in my district, but each one of you could name a facility in your district. One of them wrote to me to express his frustration with those who are preventing the government from reopening. He writes, and I quote, I'm quite tired of being punished when my only crime is supporting our great nation with my labor. May I have one additional minute?
Grant the gentleman an additional minute.
I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman's recognized
for
for
doing
1 minute.
And I want to thank my Republican colleagues for recognizing that pain and unfairness and bringing this bill to the floor. I hope all of us will support this bill. Another constituent of mine who works at Pax River said this: please continue to work toward a solution that ends the furloughs for all federal employees affected by the shutdown, not just a select few, as we're doing. Mr. Speaker, we must reopen our government, and we could do so today, this hour. But until the majority allows a vote on the bill to reopen the government, let us at least provide the dedicated, patriotic federal employees who want nothing more than to go back to work with a peace of mind that they will still be paid for their service. I want to thank Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, like Mr. Wolf, has been an extraordinary leader on behalf of federal employees. Gerald Connolly, Congressman Connolly, Steve Lynch sits here. Others on the Republican side who have been aligned on that effort as well. Surely we, the board of directors of the greatest enterprise on earth, can take care of our employees and give them confidence that they deserve. And I thank the Speaker for the additional time, and I yield back the balance of the time I don't have.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland